Part 3, Chapter 2 of The Magpie by Douglas Durkin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Atul Sharma, Winnipeg, Canada. Part 3, Chapter 2. Before the end of the first week in July, Sharples and Craig had disposed of the last bushel of Charnley's barley on a market that held firm through the whole operation. "Just under $90,000, Charnley confessed in Sharples' office when the latter ventured to ask him how he had come out of the transaction. "And I would have gone over the 100,000 mark if I had held that first $500,000 for another week."
"Well," Sharples commented, $90,000 is a lot of money. I don't see what better luck a man would want than that."
"Luck? You've been long enough in this game, Sharples, to know that the amount of money a man makes, or loses for that matter, doesn't really mean anything. The first deal I made was in flax. After waiting for 2 months and pyramiding my profits, I came out of the market a little over $2,100 to the good. The next day, the market took another jump of 2 cents. The loss of that 2 cents a bushel that I might have made if I'd stayed in another 24 hours hurt more than the discovery that there was no Santa Claus."
"In other words, Charnley,"
Sharples remarked, half jocularly,
"you're just a young hog."
"I've never seen you throwing away any chances," Charnley retorted.
"And I don't think you will. But you don't hear me kicking about what I haven't got. When I'm out of a deal, I put it behind me and do my best to forget it. If a man gives too much thought to what has happened in the past, even if he's been in luck, he's going to get cold feet sooner or later. If he can't take his losses like his winnings, if he can't roll them all together and put them out of mind, he shouldn't be in the game at all. A good gambler starts every day as if it was his first."
"Well, maybe so, Sharples," Charnley mused.
"I was short a $500,000 wheat once. I put over 50,000 in the bank under my wife's name for a drawing account. I had another 50,000 in government bonds. I had 100 lots of real estate worth another 100,000, and I had a little over 20,000 cash in my own name at the bank. Altogether, I was worth well up to $250,000. As I say, I was short a $500,000 in May wheat. I took a run to Chicago. When I went round to the Board of Trade the next morning, wheat had taken a jump of 1.50 cents. I sold 100,000 more. The next day, I came back to Minneapolis. The market had gone up another 2 cents. I sold another 150. When I got back home, I hit the market with 250 more during the next 3 days and kept the price where it was. In 2 weeks, the price went up 8 cents. I had to put up margins amounting to more than $100,000. Before I covered, the real estate was gone, the bonds were cleaned out. I had wiped out my credit at the bank, and my wife had 40 cents left in her account. Besides, I owed the clearinghouse more than $9,000.
"Good God!" Charnley exclaimed.
"That's not all," Sharples went on. "Inside 48 hours, the market turned and went back in a week to where it started from. When I told my wife it had gone back, and she realized we would have been nearly $500,000 to the good if we could have hung on for another 2 days, she just sat down and laughed. I laughed too. A man can shed tears over a little bad luck, but when it goes against you like that, there's nothing left to do but laugh. Laugh or jump into the river."
"The fickle dame has never played any such tricks on me," Charnley remarked.
"You'll never know whether you are a good gambler or a poor sport till she does," Sharples replied. "And it's worth more than money to find out."
With confidence born of success, Charnley resolved upon a bolder enterprise, this time in October barley. Fortune had smiled on him during the weeks of May and June. The operations that had been so successful for Charnley had been carried through on a market that had been consistently firm. The crop of the previous year had been far below the average. During the period over which Charnley had done his trading, there had been an active foreign demand with only a small visible supply to meet it. As a result, the market had advanced several cents between the day on which he had sold his last bushel and the last day of July, when deliveries were called for. From the early days of June, however, reports from the prairies were consistently favorable, and the promise of a large crop had depressed the market. During July, the sentiment had been overwhelmingly bearish. The Fordyce people, heaviest exporters of barley in the exchange, were having their innings after a long fight with the bulls, who made them sweat for every bushel of barley they had bought for July delivery. During the last days of July, old man Fordyce himself had thrown himself into the fight to stem the rising tide before his orders were filled. With October barley losing from 1 cent to 3 cents every day, however, Fordyce walked about the floor of the trading room with a grin on his face that betrayed his complete satisfaction with the trend of the market. Trailing behind him, watching every move he made, were a score of smaller traders who looked to Fordyce to lead them to fortune before the end of the summer. "Go short in October barley," was the motto. One heard it in the corridors and in the elevators, even in the streets outside the building. It had become a sort of slogan among the office boys and messengers wherever they met in the halls or flitted about among the traders on the floor. Go short in October barley. By the middle of August, Charnley had not ventured to make more than 6 small trades. Both Craig and Sharples, sensitive to each day's fluctuation in the prices, warned him to keep clear, and Charnley had taken the warning without protest. "You can't fight the Fordyce gang single-handed," Craig told him time after time. "Wait till they've had their turn. It's coming to them anyhow. They haven't done much more than follow the market down its natural trend. Keep your eye on Cartwright. I don't think he has 1,000 October barley on his books altogether." Jim Cartwright was the most consistent bull in the market. Daily he wandered about the floor, testing the market's weakness by making a bid for 50 or 100,000 bushels at an advance on the market, only to have the bid taken up by one of his own brokers. Toward the middle of the month, Craig called Charnley aside as he stood at the entrance of the boardroom. "Look for a change," he said quietly. "They've struck bottom." He didn't tell Charnley that he had orders in his pocket to buy 100,000 bushels of October barley for Cartwright and to buy it at the market price. 3 days later, with the price of barley steady at $1.62, Craig bought 200,000 bushels on Charnley's account. The following Friday, he added another 100,000 at $1.61 3/4. The market closed that day at $1.61 1/2. Charnley gave Craig a check for $1,250 to cover his loss in margins, and for more than a week, the market held firm around $1.61, advancing or declining 1/8 of a cent on offerings of small lots by scalpers. The dog days had set in. During the week of Marion's absence, Craig spent much of his time helping Martha Lane perfect her arrangements for the exhibit, which she had decided to hold in the first week of October. They had gone together to visit Amir and Jeanette whenever possible, and the four had spent glorious evenings in Jeanette's apartment, the two men talking over the latest developments in the strike, but more particularly in the world at large, where Amir saw nothing but a consistent effort on the part of the leaders on both sides of the Atlantic to swing back into the old lines and surrender the destiny of the human race once more to the diplomats, who met to play their age-old game behind closed curtains.
"The only recovery in the world is just where we had some hope life was extinct," Amir declared. "Stins exploits Germany. England will be in control of the world's oil in another 5 years. The United States has the world's gold and is buying the soul of every small country in the world with her national loans, all preparing on a vast scale for a trade war that will culminate in another Holocaust. Give them another 10 years to get ready, Forrester. Then set another firecracker off in Sarajevo, and the preachers will be in the streets once more calling upon the youth of the world to die in defense of an outraged humanity." Craig found himself struggling against the admission. In his mind was the memory of the Millie Dyers of the world, the wives whose husbands had gone. "They will not give their sons, Amir. They will not," he protested. They would not. Jeanette and Martha took sides as it pleased them, now with Craig, now with Amir,
but almost invariably in agreement between themselves. Concerning Marion, Craig was almost in despair. He had gone down with Gilbert Nason every Saturday and had stayed over until late Sunday evening. He had brought along books and magazines and boxes of candy, like a bashful young lover courting the attentions of his lady-love. He had hoped. He had tried every art. He had done his utmost to please her. One night in particular, the last Saturday in July, he had tried a plan that he had worked out with almost foolish faith in the outcome. Vicky Howard had gone down to spend the weekend, and Croker had been invited as well. There was a moon in a lake of glass. The shoreline was like a pattern cut from black paper and stretched along the edge of the lake in the moonlight. The islands were like dumb monsters, asleep under the stars. He had induced Marion to come with him, and they had stolen away in the shadows that covered the path leading down the hill to the side of the lake. There he had lifted her in his arms and had set her in a canoe. Silently he had pushed the frail craft into the lake and had threaded his way among the islands till they had come to a rounded bay lined with tall reeds. Sliding the nose of the canoe into the sandy shore, he had stepped out and lifted her once more in his arms. Carrying her to the top of a shouldering rock, he had found a place all mossy under the branches of a tall tamarack and had set her down. He had carried a cushion from the canoe and laid it in place for her head. Then he had sat on the moss beside her and talked. He had told her of his loneliness without her, of the hopes that had been born in him during the black, rain-drenched nights in Flanders, of how she had come to him as the fulfillment of much that he had dreamed, of how he still hoped and wanted her to help him keep faith in his better self, of how her beauty and love and passion had made him proud, and of how he wanted her still, wanted her with all his life and all his strength and all his hope in the world that was to be. He had leaned above her to put his lips to hers, but Marion had fallen asleep. During the last week in August, he received a brief letter from Marion telling him that she was planning a house party for the end of the week. She wanted him to get into touch with the crowd, Croker and Charnley and Ayers, Vicky Howard and the Frawley girl. She urged him particularly to invite Martha Lane to come along too and make the party complete. The next day Martha telephoned him from Jeanette's apartment. He gave her the invitation that had come from Marion. "I'll go," she said promptly, "if you want me." "If I want you? Of course I want you." "Then yours be the responsibility," she replied. Nason joined them at the station on Friday evening and took Martha into his care from the moment he was introduced to her. He confessed a lay interest in art and insisted on her telling him all about her exhibit. The telling occupied the time of the entire trip to Menaki, and when they got down and were met by Marion and Dickie, the old man led the way with Martha to where the launch awaited them at the landing below the hill. Later, from the lake, they saw the cottage perched on the bluff, its porches gaily decked in bright streamers of bunting that fluttered and shone in the light of the westering sun. Gilbert Nason, unusually hilarious, led a cheer as they rounded the point and came into full view of the cottage, and a moment later Mrs. Nason appeared on the front porch and waved her hand to them. Everybody was in gay spirits. The cool breeze from the lake, fragrant with spruce and tamarack, was particularly exhilarating to people from the hot streets of the city, and the prospect of 2 whole days and nights with nothing to do but romp in the open was actually exciting. By the time they sat down to the table, a table brightly decorated and lighted by candles that stood in a double row down the center, the contagion of gaiety had spread even to Dickie, who had seated himself beside Martha without having made any apology for the preference. Craig had never seen a company so thoroughly satisfied with themselves and with the world they lived in. Marion was more like herself than she had been for months. Even Croker's jibes at things in general were tempered with rare good humor that invoked almost boisterous laughter from Gilbert Nason, beside whom he sat. Ayers forgot his Oxford manner and argued with Miss Frawley about the legitimate degree of interest a professional nurse might show in her male patients. Charnley found his chief delight in chaffing Vicky Howard, and she her chief delight in encouraging it. In an incredible short time, it seemed, the meal was over, and the men went to the porch to smoke their cigars while the lady set the house to order. Presently, Mrs. Nason came out to announce that the girls had decided on a bonfire on the beach and a swim by moonlight. "That means we'll have to get out now and drag the wood down," Nason said. The men fell in with the idea at once, and for fully half an hour scrambled among Nason's supply of old clothes until all were dressed for the woods. Then followed an hour or more of clambering over rocks and through underbrush in search of fuel for the beach fire. Loud calls for help from someone who had found a log too heavy to handle alone. Smothered imprecations where a bark shin rewarded undue eagerness. And above all, the voice of Gilbert Nason, exhorting them like a foreman of a railway gang. But the pile was built, a great heap of logs and dried sticks and broken limbs, and not a little driftwood that Ayers and Dickey had brought by boat from a couple of nearby islands. When the men returned to the cottage, they found the ladies already in their bathing suits and sitting about with wraps thrown about them. "Hurry, hurry," Marion admonished them. "The moon will be up in an hour, and we want to light the fire while it's dark." The men scattered into the rooms and emerged in a few minutes in their bathing suits, ready for the beach. It had grown quite dark by the time the company had left the house, and headed by Gilbert Nason, who carried an improvised torch to light the way, made a gay procession along the narrow path that led to the sandy shore where the wood had been heaped. While Nason set his torch to the pile, they arranged themselves in line for a snake dance, and for some minutes leaped about the mounting flames like savages on an island in the South Seas. When they could dance no longer, they flung themselves on the warm sands and watched the white sparks go up like snowflakes, lifted by the wind and carried out over the smooth surface of the lake. When the roar of the flames had died down sufficiently, Nason regaled them with an old pioneer song of some 20 verses that told the tragic story of a reckless hero of the plains. Ayers was inveigled into contributing an Indian legend, spun out of waterfalls and moonlight and the love of an Indian maiden. And then, suddenly, the moon came up. While Nason and Mrs. Nason and Dickey sat together on the shore and gathered the burning embers into the center of the fire, the others raced into the water and struck out towards a small island that lay steeped in moonlight, a few hundred yards from shore. Halfway to the island, Marion suggested that they swim around it and back to their starting point, without pausing to rest. Croker was the only one to protest, but by the time they had reached the island, he was still going strong and scorned Ayers' suggestion that they put in to shore and rest before returning. They were rounding the furthest point of the island when Marion spoke to Craig for the first time since they had left the shore. "Craig, dear, I think Vicky is having trouble," she said. "She's falling behind. You'd better wait for her." Craig dropped back and waited for Vicky to come up with him. "How are you coming?" he asked her. For a moment she did not answer. I think maybe I'd better rest, just a little, if you'll wait," she said finally. Craig called to the others and led the way to the shore of the island, followed by Vicky. When he had lifted himself out of the water, he put his hand down and pulled the girl up beside him on a rounded rock covered with moss. She sank down beside him with a sigh and wiped the water from her shoulders, shining in the moonlight. For some moments they sat together in silence, their eyes on the water, in which strange shadows moved like great fish sailing by in opalescent light. The stillness about them was broken only by the voices of the swimmers returning to shore. "Well," Craig inquired at last, "are you good for it now?" She moved so that her shoulder touched him, ever so lightly. "I suppose I could go. I wasn't really very tired. But don't let's go. Not just yet." She spoke softly, in odd little bursts of words, as if she was about to cease speaking after each phrase. Craig looked at her round face, her soft lips, and her eyes that seemed twice their natural size in the pale light. "You'll be getting cold," he warned her. "No,
I don't think so. Anyhow, I like it here. The shadows and the moonlight and everything." She paused a moment and turned her eyes up to him. "Do you know that we have not been together since the last time we were down here?" "Since the last time we were here," Craig replied. "Why, I mean really together, alone, so we could talk. You know, I liked you that night." Craig fortified himself by chuckling. "Now, Vicky, you know your weakness. This moonlight isn't good for you. What's more, it's time we were on our way. They'll be wondering what has happened." She was silent for some time following the mild rebuke, and Craig got to his feet and stood before her, waiting. "Don't go yet," she urged. "People don't wonder about such things nowadays. They used to, before the war, but not now. They take some things for granted. And anyhow, I don't care if they do wonder. If I could be with you, they could wonder all they liked." "Why, Vicky," Craig exclaimed. She got to her feet and started towards the water. At the edge of the rock she paused and turned to him, her soft, round body gleaming in the moonlight. "Oh, you are so stupid," she said. "You don't seem to understand." He stood on the edge of the rock beside her, ready to plunge into the water. "I may be stupid, Vicky," he admitted, "but a man is always safer if he's a little stupid." She caught him by the arms with her two hands and turned him about till he faced her. "It's because you are so safe that I could almost hate you. You knew I cared for you a year ago. I do now, in spite of her. And there isn't one in the crowd who doesn't know how little she cares for you. If you weren't so hopelessly stupid and so hopelessly old-fashioned." Craig winced a little, as if from some physical hurt. "Just a minute, Vicky. You say everyone knows that Marion doesn't care for me?" "A woman can't be in love with more than one man at a time," she retorted. He put out his hand to catch her by the shoulder, but she slipped away from him and plunged into the water. He waited till she came to the surface, then stood for a moment and watched her as she struck out along the side of the island and gained the open water of the lake. Then he sprang over the edge of the rock and followed. Craig did not speak with Vicky Howard again that night. If it were true that Marion loved someone else, where was the need of talking to Vicky, or to anyone else? Love is the center of life. If love be taken away, what is there left of life? The center gone, only the edges, the broken fragments of a circle that can never be closed. He did his best to enter the spirit of fun-making that prevailed upon the beach fire for more than an hour after the swimmers had returned. But he could not free himself from the feeling that these figures dancing about the dying fire were only ghost forms, moths perhaps, that fluttered crazily in the red glow of the embers. If it were true that Marion loved someone else. Mrs. Nason had made coffee over the fire and served it in the open while the others sat round in a circle. Craig sat with his cup in his hands, his eyes on a little heap of glowing ash near the center of the bed of live coals. He watched it whiten and fall apart, as if old age and decay had overtaken it in the few short moments since he had first seen it. If it were true. "What makes you so terribly dull?" It was Marion herself who asked the question. She had come and sat down on the sand beside him to drink her coffee. Before he could reply, a burst of laughter came from the other side of the fire where Charnley had picked up Vicky Howard in his arms and had improvised a scene in which a hero had rescued a wretched maiden who had been at the mercy of a wild beast, who was Ayers. Vicky clung with her plump arms about Charnley's neck until he finally collapsed on the sand, Vicky still clinging to him. "Your heroine is a little heavy, Claude," Marion cried above the laughter. "She should be built more like you," Vicky retorted as she sat up and gave Marion a vicious look. But the sound of Vicky's voice only brought again to Craig's mind the words she had spoken to him before leaping into the water. If it were true. It couldn't be true. Walking home at midnight, along the little path that led through interwoven moonlight and shadow, Craig found Martha Lane beside him. "I have had quite a nice chat with Dickie,"
she told him. "I noticed," he replied. "Dickie has been writing a short story this summer," she went on, "all about a youth of 20 who had an affair with a woman of 40, and 20 years later had another affair with a girl of 20, only to find that the girl was the daughter of the woman he had known 20 years before, and his own daughter besides." "He's running true to form," Craig responded. "The boy has something in him, Craig," Martha observed in defense of Dickie. "He has creative ability of a kind, but he has never been touched by the sense of the heroic in life. That's what has happened to most of the boys who were just too young to fight and just too old to usher in the next generation. The world will have to wait for a new crop." But Craig's mind was obsessed. The world was somehow out of reach. Its Dickies and its lost ideals and its shallow mockeries. One thing mattered. Only one. He must get back to the center of things. He must not lose his grip there. Perhaps it would be best to speak to Marion, to tell her what Vicky had said. If it were true, Marion would tell him. She was like that. She had told him, that night in her room in the Nason home, that she did not love him. She had hinted something to that effect, at least. But she had been angry then. She could not have meant it in her heart. If it were true, it wasn't true. It couldn't be true. And from the lake, as he lay awake that night, struggling against the doubts that assailed him, there came intermittently the wilderness cry of a loon. End of Part 3, Chapter 2. Part 3, Chapter 3 of The Magpie by Douglas Durkin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Atul Sharma, Winnipeg, Canada. Part 3, Chapter 3. On a grey day in the latter part of September, Croker met Ayers on the street. "Have you seen our friend Forrester lately?" Croker asked. Ayers had seen him just once since they had all been together at the lake. "I was just wondering what you thought about him," Croker continued. "Which way are you heading?" "Good. I'll go along a couple of blocks with you. I've just been over to the grain exchange. Had a talk with him. They call him the Magpie over there, but you knew that. Christened him that one day for a joke, because he never had anything to say. The way they call a nigger Snowball. He sort of turned the joke on them, though, when he got married. Turned out he could talk about as much as any of them. Only he talked mostly about serious things. Well, I wish you could see him and tell me what you think. Something's happened there, Ayers. Something inside, deep down. He's gone back to his old silences again. Doesn't talk any more about things. I've seen him every few days in the last month, and I tell you he's got to get out. Got to get away somewhere. They don't last long in the pit. A lot of them don't. But he was strong. Looked good for a lifetime at any business. He looks good yet, in a way. Big, husky. Hear him above the whole pitfall when he makes a trade. But he's not there. Something's eating at him. He used to take my little jokes. You know what I mean. Just yesterday he asked me, "Croker, where's it all going to end?" I know what he meant. I told him it would all end like the road that led out of the city and dwindled to a prairie trail and finally became a squirrel track and ran up a tree. He used to smile at things like that. He didn't smile yesterday. He turned on me, slowly. "No," he said, "there's more to it than that, Croker. There's something that lasts." And then he was silent again. I talked, just gabbled along for an hour, but I don't think he heard anything I said. Not that it mattered. Here's where I leave you. Come up to the office some day and we'll go out to lunch together. Maybe you'll be able to make him talk. Seems to me if he could only talk he'd feel better. Looks like that to me. Call me up. From the upper edge of the pit, Craig watched the milling mass of traders scrambling beneath him. After a steady advance in the price of barley during the first 3 weeks in September, the market had suddenly collapsed in a week to $1.62, the price at which Craig and Sharples had bought heavily on Charnley's orders. The head of a large firm of exporters, who had found himself in difficulties a year before on account of limited shipping facilities at the head of the lake, had maneuvered shrewdly during the inactive days of July and August. He had acquired control of fully 3/4 of the tonnage available for shipping of the fall crop. By the latter part of September, exporters began to foresee the possibility of having a number of contracts on their hands which they could not meet. A desire on the part of the longs to get rid of their holdings began to show itself in the market, and the downward trend had continued for more than a week before a firmer undertone began to be felt. Cartwright, who was holding several million bushels, was the steadying influence that came into the market just when the Fordyce interests and their followers began to feel that they had routed the enemy. On the last Monday in September, after a slight break at the opening of the market, Cartwright gave Craig orders to buy 1,000,000 bushels at $1.62. Fordyce and his men hurled their offerings, only to take them taken up as soon as they were put on the market. At the end of the day, however, Craig had not been able to buy more than 500,000 bushels at the figure Cartwright had mentioned. The two forces were evidently deadlocked. They would remain so until someone with large holdings on either side or the other gave up the struggle. Charnley, after watching the struggle for days without taking any active part in it, set himself, through Craig and Sharples, to assist Cartwright in holding the enemy. As Craig watched struggling traders in the pit beneath him, he had in mind the words that Charnley had spoken to him outside the doorway to the trading room a few minutes before the opening of the market. "Take all you can get at 61.5, Charnley had told him. The first trade had been made at 1/8 of a cent above $1.62, the price it had closed at the day before. From that it moved up 1.5 cents, then dropped slowly back till it hovered at 1/8 below 62. Craig stood and listened to the chorus of discordant voices without moving a muscle in his face. Occasionally he narrowed his eyes slowly. Frequently he glanced suddenly from one side to the other, as someone attempted to undersell the market. Slowly the price moved down, 1/8 at a time. Small trades that may have been mere feelers put out by Fordyce's men. "Sell October barley at 61 3/4, someone at Craig's elbow shouted into his ear, but he did not as much as turn to see who was making the offer. 61 5/8, but Craig appeared not to hear the voice. Finally it came, a voice from the opposite side of the circle. "Sell October at 1/2. For the first time that morning, Craig's voice broke from him in a roar. "Sold! Sold!" Suddenly he became the center of attack. A dozen men rushed upon him at once from all sides. "Sell at 1/2! Sell at 1/2!" Card in hand, Craig picked the traders out one at a time and scribbled down the record of each transaction in the midst of the din. He spoke no word. He made scarcely a gesture. Occasionally, he swept one arm out before him as if he were gathering in the barley with his hand. Let them come. He was there to take their offerings and hold the market, even if he had to do it single-handed. Gradually, however, the storm subsided. A couple of Cartwright's men came into the fight, and in less than 10 minutes, the offerings had all been taken up, and the price remained at $1.61.5. As a result of those 10 minutes, however, Craig had bought 160,000 bushels of barley for Claude Charnley. Altogether, since the beginning of the deal in October barley, he had bought 460,000 bushels. That day, the market closed at $1.61.5. Charnley had incurred a loss on his previous holdings of 1/4 of a cent a bushel, about $750. While Craig was still busy with his clearing sheets, Charnley put his head in at the door. "Any time you want to check for margins, let me know," he said. "All right," Craig replied. "I'll carry it for a few days, till the market steadies down." And when Charnley withdrew, Craig wrote a check for $750 and took it up to the clearinghouse with his returns. Craig talked to Jeanette Bodden on the day before the opening of Martha Lane's exhibit. They were standing together in a hall in the Board of Trade building, where Martha had worked every day for the past week to arrange her display. "This has kept me going, Jeanette," he said. "This and my work in the pit. For the last month, or more. A man can't fight his own doubts, but he can fight doubt in another. She wouldn't have gone through with this if we hadn't fought her. Now I'm glad." What Craig said was true. At the last moment, Martha was ready to give up the whole undertaking. The strike had spread and had threatened to extend into a general walkout in sympathy with the original strikers. But Amir had told her not to give up. He was doing his best, night and day, to prevent the strike reaching a crisis at a season of the year when there was the least possible likelihood of the workers winning. He hoped he might succeed. A more difficult obstacle to the enterprise was the discouraging response Martha met among those to whom she had hoped to make her strongest appeal. It was this, in particular, that Craig had fought against. Day after day, he forgot his own struggle in his fight to keep Martha from giving up hope. He had not given up his own struggle. Jeanette had watched him closely during those days and had talked to him a little about Marion. She could not tell him that his doubts were without foundation, that Marion was as much in love with him as he was with her. She knew better. She had seen Marion emerging from the apartment house across the street, and was well aware that she had gone there to see Claude Charnley. But she feared Craig, feared what might happen if he knew, and she did everything in her power to delay the hour of discovery. "When we used to make a run across ground that had been mined," Craig went on, "we used to keep our eyes on the spot we were making for, to get under cover. When the ground under us began to come up where the mines were set off, it was a good thing to be able to keep your mind fixed on something. When the world begins to go to pieces under your feet, it's a good thing to have one little hold, like this, anything to keep you from getting panicky." "What are you going to do next week, when this is past?" Jeanette asked him. "Well, there'll still be my work. There'll still be... Why, what are you talking about? There'll be everything again. It's all coming out right. You'll see." "Let's hope Martha's show will come out right," Jeanette replied. "That's what matters just now." She was telling him to keep his eyes on the objective before him, turning his mind away from the ground that was breaking under his feet. That's right. Here she comes." As he spoke, Martha emerged from a small closet into which she had gone to dress for luncheon. She wore a gay little toque that sat at an impudent angle on her head, and a loose-fitting autumn jacket of tan suede over a skirt of rough wool. "Let's go," she said, smiling at them. "Even genius eats, when it can." About the middle of the following afternoon, Martha was rewarded by the first flutter of interest on the part of the public. The women drifted in idly in pairs, carrying an air of having nothing better to do. There was an occasional group of 3 or 4, lorgneted and ostentatiously scrutinizing, bearing ponderously the stamp of the connoisseur and the critic. Later, 2 or 3 swarms descended, winding up an afternoon tea with something smart and out of the ordinary. In the evening, the men came, some from sincere and intelligent interest, some from curiosity, some to catch a glimpse of Martha, who was rumored beautiful. Martha, a little pale but flawless in her poise, received them at the door, with Jeanette close by giving out the simple little catalogues they had prepared. What caught the eye immediately was the striking contrast between Martha and Jeanette Bodden. Martha's bronze hair and delicate skin were set off by a long, simple Russian gown of black and flame color. Jeanette's costume was equally simple and vivid, and presented her in all her rich, challenging beauty. The men caught their breath as they passed the two. The women wondered. Gilbert Nason, eager to count himself among the patrons of art, especially in a new country where appreciation of things artistic was likely to prove disappointing to the artist, had gone to no little trouble to place the affair on a proper footing. It was largely because of Nason's efforts that Sir Henry Wilton had consented to give the exhibit his distinguished patronage. "The thing ought to be done right, Craig," Nason had declared. "The girl deserves it." He made up a little party, the Blunts, the Streeters, Marion and Craig, himself and his wife, and had swept into the hall a few minutes after the arrival of Sir Henry and Lady Wilton. The prospect was highly pleasing. The thing had been done right, and Nason felt a little proud of the part he had played in making it a success. Craig, for his part, had taken Nason's advice and had met Blunt and his wife with every outward appearance of having forgotten the differences that had come between them. Marion, pleased with the change that had apparently come over Craig, was almost demonstrative. "I never saw you look so well, Craig," she declared as they entered the hall. "You are positively stunning." Craig put his hand on her arm and felt his heart throb as he looked at her. "You are more beautiful than ever," he told her. A moment later, he came upon Jeanette and left Marion while he spoke to her. "It's going well," he said. "I'm glad you came. I mean both of you," she replied with a glance toward Marion, where she stood talking with the Blunts. "They have ignored me, of course, but I don't mind that." Craig leaned toward her. "Don't shut them out," he pleaded. "I told you everything would turn out right in the end. It has. It's already turning out right. Someday we'll understand." And when he went back to join the group, Jeanette saw Marion extend her hand to him as she turned and met him with a smile. The evening was half spent before Craig found an opportunity to speak with Marion. He found her talking with two substantially built matrons who had been standing before a delicately modeled figure that Martha had named Fragment. It was a slender figure of a girl, poised on her toes, with her head thrown backward and her tiny breasts lifted in a movement of abandon. "It's very, very eloquent," one of the women commented, "but I cannot understand why you should call it by that name, Fragment." Martha smiled, a little sadly. "I named it that as an afterthought," she said. "I had intended calling it Love. Oh, I think it should have been called Love. That would have been most appropriate." "No," Martha observed, and the smile had died from her face. "Not quite. I didn't. Somehow I missed the feeling I tried for. It wouldn't just come out for me. I gave it up finally and changed the name of it." The point was very evidently lost in the two who were listening to her explanation. The lines of self-righteousness deepened about the mouth of the woman who had remained silent while her companion was exclaiming over the figure. She spoke as Craig came up with them. "I think your work is very pretty. Very sweet indeed, Miss Lane," she observed. "I'm Mrs. Ogletree, you may not know. There's one thing about it, however, that I find difficulty in explaining. I mean in work of this kind, taken generally, of course. I do think too much lewdness is perpetrated in the name of art, especially in sculpture. Why on earth must so much of the figure be exposed? Can you tell me that? It seems to me that very graceful effects could be achieved with drapes and wreaths, for example. I have a perfectly beautiful piece at home, the Three Graces, draped very gracefully." Mrs. Ogletree tittered suddenly and dropped her voice as she moved a little closer to Martha. "I confess I wouldn't want my husband to run around unescorted in a place like this." Her companion responded with a titter. Mrs. Ogletree grew suddenly grave. "But speaking quite seriously," she went on, "I think there are instincts, especially in men, that are roused by a display of this kind, instincts that would be better if they were discouraged." She ended with a sweeping look about her and drew her chin in slightly toward her neck, revealing, Craig noticed, a mole from which 3 long hairs protruded conspicuously. Neither Mrs. Ogletree nor her companion had seen Jeanette Bodden, who had descended suddenly upon the group and had heard the good woman's comment. "As I know men," Jeanette remarked with a smile, "I'd think it a gratifying service on the part of art if it would arouse even that, in some men." Mrs. Ogletree gave her an uncomprehending stare and moved on with her companion. Gilbert Nason was not alone in his efforts to do the right thing. He found ready support in his wife and Marion, who, as soon as the exhibit had been pronounced a success, arranged an afternoon affair at which Martha Lane could meet the best people in town. The last afternoon of the exhibit was chosen, an invitation sent to more than 100 of the city's elite. Martha left Jeanette Bodden in charge of the exhibit and attended Mrs. Nason's function, mainly out of gratitude to her hostess, and especially to Gilbert Nason, for the interest they had shown in her work. Martha would have been more comfortable if Marion had not taken complete possession of her the moment she entered the house. "I discovered her," Marion declared to all her friends, and Martha could do nothing but submit with a smile. She would have preferred being discovered by someone else, if indeed the process had been necessary at all. Not that Marion failed in graciousness or in the genuineness of her enthusiasm, but contact with Marion was something that Martha instinctively wished to avoid. Every time they met, an old hurt opened in the heart of Martha Lane. the hurt that reminded her of a hope long dead. But the affair was a tremendous success, nevertheless, and Martha had many reasons for feeling glad she had gone. Not least among the many was a rumor that reached her ears to the effect that one of her best pieces of work, a bronze Bacchante, had attracted the attention of a man who was ready to make her a handsome offer for it. Martha's first impulse was to laugh at the suggestion that her work should be taken seriously after such a brief introduction to the public. But the rumor persisted. She was told about it at least a dozen times during the afternoon, and warmly congratulated, though no one seemed to know where the offer was to come from. She determined to mention it to Marion. "Of course it's true, my dear," Marion assured her. "Why in the world shouldn't it be true?" For a moment Martha was silent. Then the full significance of the event dawned suddenly upon her. "Oh, I must tell." She paused abruptly. It was Craig Forrester to whom she wanted to run with the good news. Marion waited. "To whom?" she prompted. "Mrs. Bodden already knows about it, I'm quite sure. You have become very close friends, haven't you? I should think she would have told you." Martha turned to find Marion's eyes searching her strangely. "My dear old daddy will positively weep when he hears about it," Martha replied. "He's very sentimental where my work is concerned." Marion smiled. "I adore sentimental old people," she exclaimed. The announcement did not disturb Jeanette Bodden. "You knew about it before," Martha accused her, "and you have been keeping it a secret from me." "To tell you the truth, I did hear about it yesterday," Jeanette replied. "But things like that make good secrets. I'm never sure about promises that come from men who have enough money to pay $5,000 for a bronze." $5,000! Martha exclaimed. Jeanette started. "I thought you knew. Didn't they tell you how much?" "They didn't mention the price, naturally," Martha replied, "and it would have been a little out of place. I'm terribly curious to know where the offer is coming from." "Don't be. Curiosity and enthusiasm are nearly always lost in affairs of this kind. I have my own idea about it, but horses wouldn't drag it out of me." At home that evening, Craig suggested that it would be fitting for them to visit Martha on the last evening of the exhibit. "I agree with you," Marion said, "but I have a meeting of the Dramatic Club executive tonight that may keep me out quite late." I have been with Martha all afternoon. She must have met at least 50, yes, more, of the nicest people in town. I wish you would go down. You can explain to her why I did not go with you." Craig threw himself into his chair, disappointed, a little perplexed. "When did you know about the executive meeting?" he asked. "I have known about it for some time. Why do you ask?" "I really don't know. I had rather counted on having you come along, that was all. I'll call for you and drive you home." "No, I'm not sure when we'll be through, and we may have to go down to the theater for a while after the meeting. Don't bother about me. There's always somebody with a car. I expect Claude will be there." Claude. There it was again. The old doubt, the old suspicion raised its head in spite of his efforts to keep it down, and just when he thought he had mastered it. "Then I'll drive you down," he said. There was a note in his voice that made her turn suddenly and face him. "I thought we had put that all behind us," she said. "I have no objection to your driving me down, and I have none to your calling for me to take me home, if it were convenient for me. But when you make your suggestions in that tone, I simply will not listen to them. If you don't mind, I'll go down on a streetcar. I'll be leaving too late for you to wait for me anyhow." She left him abruptly and went to her room. What had he said? What had there been in the tone of voice with which he had made the suggestion? Then suddenly, he realized that whatever his voice had betrayed, there had been black suspicion in his heart. Well, the fight was back upon him again, all to be gone through again, days of it perhaps, and all because he had not known enough to keep silent when his heart was not right. He waited till 8:30, hoping that Marion might yet decide to come down from her room and permit him to drive her to the executive meeting. When she did not come, he put on his coat and went out. At the doorway of the exhibit room, a half-hour later, Martha met him. A little red spot on either cheek spread in a quick flare to her throat, as she took his proffered hands.
"There's news, good news, Craigie," she exclaimed. "I have a prospective purchaser. I don't know who, but he wants to buy my Bachante. Jeanette says he will pay me $5,000 for it."
She became suddenly pensive.
"I only hope it's someone that's possible, someone who understands, at least."
Craig put her 2 hands together between his own and patted them affectionately. "I'm glad, Marty, glad." He looked at her strangely. "Marty," he said slowly, "someone ought to love you. I've never seen you so beautiful as you are tonight. I don't believe I ever really saw you before." She withdrew her hands, almost as if she were afraid of him, afraid of the look in his eyes and the sound of his voice. Rose Barron suddenly threw herself between them.
"Hello, Captain Forrester. You remember me, don't you? We met one night at dinner, Jeanette's place."
Craig remembered.
"Ivan is here too. He's dumb, can't talk, hasn't said a word since he came into the hall. Don't you like this?"
Craig stared at her as if he didn't quite comprehend.
"This is the beginning," she went on. "We're going to have our own art. We're going to have studios and artists and models and a bohemian quarter and everything. Aren't we, Miss Lane?"
Martha took the girl's arm, and the 3 walked together down the long room to where Ivan stood before a figure of a dancing satyr. He was staring fixedly at the figure and did not hear them as they came up. But when they had come quite close, Martha saw him lift a hand and lightly touch a hoof of the exquisite creature. His touch was furtive, as if the action had been prompted by some inner urge, and when Rose spoke to him, he started as if he had been caught doing what he knew had been forbidden. The look in his face as he turned to them was the look of a child. It brought the tears suddenly to Martha's eyes, tears of understanding and gratitude. Rose saw the look in the boy's face and turned to Craig.
"Don't you think Ivan is wonderful?" she said. "I love him."
A moment later they found Jeanette. She was in a fit of depression.
"It's partly because we have come to the end of one of the happiest months in my life," she explained to Craig when he pressed her to account for her mood. "We have worked together on this and have been very happy. Now it's over. There will be other work for us," Martha said consolingly. "Besides, we have come together now, and who can tell what we may do in the future?"
Jeanette got to her feet from where she had been sitting and glanced toward the door.
"It's the future that I'm thinking of," she said. "I haven't told you." Her eyes were still on the doorway. "There come Blunt and Nason and a half-dozen of your patrons, Martha."
They prepared to go and meet the visitors, but Craig laid a hand on Jeanette's arm to restrain her. "Has anything happened?" he asked her.
"I don't know," she said quietly. "I'm expecting Amir in a few minutes. He has been with the strike committee all day. As a result of those disturbances in Market Square last week, the mayor has forbidden street assemblies of any kind until the strike has been settled. The strike committee received notice last night. Tuttle has been doing his best to get the men to defy the mayor's order, and Amir has been fighting it out with him. He telephoned me at 6 o'clock. The situation didn't look promising when he spoke to me. He may come in any moment now, however, and then we'll know. But here come our friends. Duty calls."
Jeanette herself was the most gracious of them all when Nason came down upon them in his breeziest manner, and drew Blunt with him into the group. "Here we are," he announced. "Came along to congratulate you on a most successful exhibition." He was talking to Martha. "Fact is, you've got us all talking art. Yes, and believing in it too, by golly. More real artists who dress like human beings and less of the long-haired variety who talk a lot of bunk about psychoanalysis and free love. Eh, Blunt?" Blunt was eager to add his word of approval.
"I believe art is one of the main hopes of our civilization," he remarked, "and I think we ought to do all we can to bring local talent to the fore. If we could get the people interested in this sort of thing, we might get their minds off things that don't concern them. We can't all be businessmen, and we can't all be politicians, and we can't all be artists, but we all have our place, and we ought to keep it. If we all filled our place as well as you, Miss Lane, the world would be a much better place to live in."
Jeanette found Craig's toe and stepped on it.
"I might tell you now," Blunt went on. "There is a little matter of interest to you, Miss Lane. It is of interest to us all, I think. A matter, in fact, that is the excuse for our making this personal call at so late an hour. We are waiting for the arrival of Mrs. Nason and Mrs. Blunt before we speak of it. They ought to be along any moment. You will permit us to look around once more while we wait, I am sure."
Martha smiled in reply and invited them to spend the time as they wished while they waited. And as they moved away, the tall form of Amir appeared in the dim light of the doorway. Jeanette and Craig saw him at the same moment. His heavy brows had fallen so low that his eyes were almost hidden. In his face was the look of a man who had been through torment. Craig turned after a glance at Amir and met Jeanette's eyes. A look of pain swept over her face. They knew that Amir had lost the fight. Craig started across the floor to meet Amir, but Jeanette was already hurrying toward him, where he stood in the doorway. When Jeanette reached him, he put out a hand and remained, unmoving, with his eyes shifting slowly from Craig to the group at the other end of the long room. Even when Craig came and stood before him, waiting for him to speak, he held his silence. His eyes fixed upon Blunt and Nason where they stood on either side of Martha before the bronze Bacchante. "Tell us," Jeanette urged. He turned his eyes to them as if he had not seen them before. A faint smile touched his lips. "My dear, I have failed," he said with infinite sadness in his voice. She did not speak in reply. She took his great hand and pressed it between her two soft white hands, then drew back a little as Craig stepped closer. "It may not mean so much, in the end," Craig ventured. Amir looked at him for a moment before he spoke. "It means—" He paused. "It means much. Let's get out of here. I must breathe." "We can't go yet, dear," Jeanette told him. "Martha has to wait. She has sold—" "Then we'll wait," Amir replied. "Here, Forrester, let me go down with you. Don't run away from me." Together, the three walked down the full length of the long room and came at last to the group in the center of which stood Martha Lane, talking to Nason and Blunt. Martha looked up as Jeanette joined the group. At the same moment, Lasker Blunt raised his eyes and encountered those of Amir, who had paused on the outskirts of the little circle with his hand on Craig's arm. For a moment, the two men eyed each other without speaking. Presently, Nason turned his face toward Amir, and in a moment every eye in the group was trained upon the man who had entered so silently that none except Craig and Jeanette had seen him. When the atmosphere was most tense, Gilbert Nason made a brave attempt to relieve it. "Ah, Amir," he greeted him affably. We hardly expected to find you here." Amir smiled. "You wouldn't," he replied. "You wouldn't expect to see a nobody in an art gallery." Nason coughed lightly. I wouldn't say that. "I know you wouldn't," Amir retorted. "You wouldn't say anything that was in such bad taste, but you think it. I haven't come here to look at these." He swept his arm about him to indicate Martha's work. "They are all beautiful, and I'd like nothing better than to spend an evening with them. I feel the need of it. But I came here because I have no place to go, because I am an outcast, because these are my friends. I have thought you a fair-minded man, Mr. Nason, and a man of good intentions. You will be sorry to know that the people I have been working with have decided to pay no respect to your mayor's orders. Our friend Tuttle will issue a general invitation tomorrow for a public demonstration to take place the following day. You will be sorry to hear that. I am sorry to have to tell you. We are sorry for very different reasons." "We are all sorry," Blunt put in. Amir turned slowly and looked at Blunt. "It would be in bad taste for me to call you a liar, Mr. Blunt, particularly in a place of this kind. But it is equally in bad taste for you to lie." "I believe the ladies have come," Nason said quickly. All eyes turned toward the door, where Mrs. Nason had just entered, followed by Mrs. Blunt and 3 or 4 other women in evening wraps. "Come away," Jeanette whispered to Amir, and together the two moved a little apart as Mrs. Nason approached. Mrs. Nason put her arm about Martha in an affectionate embrace.
"I hope we have not kept you all waiting," she said. "Not at all," Martha replied, and Craig observed that her voice was tense with excitement. "We are ready, Gilbert," Mrs. Nason announced after a few moments of animated conversation that followed the arrival of the ladies. Nason nodded and then stepped toward Martha, his face beaming as he looked at her. He stood for a moment, looking at her, then turned and faced Blunt. "Don't you think you ought to do this, Blunt?" he said. "I don't know that I'm quite equal to it."
Go ahead, Blunt smiled. "I'll help you out if you get stuck."
Nason turned again to Martha and gave her his most engaging smile. "We have all agreed that your work is worthy of some practical recognition," he said. A hush had fallen upon the others as they stood about listening to Nason's voice, their eyes upon Martha's face. "We have not seen anything like this from one of our own, of ourselves, one might say." Nason resumed with a somewhat pompously inclusive sweep of his arms. "Now that we have found you out and know what you can do, we have made up our minds that you shall stay with us, not run away to some eastern metropolis as so many of our other artists have done. To come to the point at once, Miss Martha, we have picked one piece, this beautiful figure before which we stand, and have decided to make you an offer for it. We should have inquired, perhaps, and found out whether your Bacchante whether you would be willing to part with it before we ventured to make you an offer." He paused to give Martha time to reply. She raised her eyes and hesitated a moment, not knowing just how to express what was in her mind. "I'm sure," she said slowly, "I would be very ungrateful if I refused to consider anything so gratifying as an offer for a piece of my work." "Then, to speak plainly and briefly," Nason continued, "I have been asked to inform you that one of our most distinguished citizens will be proud to make Bacchante his personal property, if you will be pleased to regard this, which he gives you in return, as expressing only in part the high regard we have for the work and for the artist who wrought it." It was very evident that he had memorized the exact words in which he presented his offer. As he concluded, he drew an envelope from his breast pocket and handed it to Martha, who took it with trembling fingers and held it for a moment while the silence grew tense about her. Lifting the flap of the envelope slowly, she drew out a folded slip of pale blue paper and opened it. It was a check for $5,000. The name at the bottom was that of Lasker Blunt. For a moment, Martha stood looking at the signature, her hands trembling uncontrollably, the tears starting to her eyes. She turned and found Craig beside her. "Craigie," she said, almost in a whisper, and showed him the check. "Mr. Blunt," Nason said, turning and placing his hand on the bronze figure behind him, "I envy you the possession of so handsome an example of the work of one of our own artists." A brief round of applause broke from the group as Nason bowed and stepped aside to give place to Blunt, who came forward as the applause died and took his position beside Martha. "Speech, Blunt," Nason called. Blunt smiled, turned to look at the bronze figure behind him, then shifted his eyes to Martha.
"I am sure you would be better pleased to hear from the little lady whose fingers worked many long hours before her dreams finally took shape in the beautiful image we have before us, and which I shall be very proud to own. I must not forget, however, that I have not yet received the artist's acceptance of my humble offer. Realizing that we are a practical people, and that art, if it is to have any real place in our modern life, must have its practical application, I wish to convince Miss Lane of the utmost sincerity of my intentions with regard to her work. I have no intention of placing the figure, much as I prize it, personally, in an obscure corner of my own home, and leaving it there to be forgotten. I have determined, in short, to do my little part towards making her work known throughout the country. To that end, I have consulted with my good friend Mr. Nason, and have learned that small replicas of the figure can be made from metals sufficiently inexpensive to justify my having a few thousand of them struck off and distributed among the customers of my company for use as paperweights. The figure will remain the same, except that it will be in miniature, with stamped lettering along.
He paused abruptly as he felt a hand upon his arm.
He turned to find Craig Forrester confronting him. The check Nason had presented to Martha crumpled and clutched in his fingers. "You have said enough. You have said enough," Craig told him. "Don't you see what you are doing?" On one arm he held Martha, who seemed to have grown suddenly too weak to stand alone. From some distance away came Jeanette's cry as she rushed in to relieve Craig of his burden. And slowly, from where he had been standing apart, Amir moved down upon the group, his two arms held before him like those of a wrestler coming to meet his opponent. He was moving toward Lasker Blunt, whose face had grown suddenly white at the sight of the great shoulders stooped forward and the spreading arms. Craig, with a glance at Amir, leaped to Blunt's side. "Go away! Go away!" he said in a voice that was tense from terror. "Go away! Go away!" But Blunt only moved back a step, his eyes still upon Amir. Craig turned suddenly and stood before Amir. "Amir! Amir! For God's sake, Amir! There are women here, Amir!" Amir paused, lifted his shoulders slowly, let his arms fall at his sides, drew a deep breath and smiled. "Tell them to get out," he said. "Let them go, and take their women with them." With Nason's help, Craig cleared the room of all but Martha and Jeanette and Amir. Blunt was the last to go. At the door, he paused a moment and turned upon Craig. "Forrester," he said, "your wife and your wife's people save you. I hope you will not forget that. As for this beast you call your friend, he is doomed." "Get out," Craig ordered. "We wouldn't wipe our feet on you." An hour later, the four friends were together in Jeanette's apartment. Jeanette and Martha had talked and wept and talked again, and had ended it all by laughing. Amir and Craig had remained silent through it all. Presently, however, the two men found themselves alone. "Well, my friend," Amir said, "there you are. I heard Blunt's words when he halted at the door. He spoke the truth. I'm doomed. Blunt knows I'm dangerous. He likes Tuttle's methods better. There will be a parade, a demonstration, a fight in the streets. The public imagination will be fired for a day or two. The strike will be settled, the men will go back to work, and Blunt will be happy again. That's the way the Blunts work everywhere, and that's the way the people are taught to forget their indignation. And so we'll go on. We'll go on till the Blunts begin to disagree among themselves. Then they'll put the Tuttles behind the bars and conscript the males who are physically fit, and the next war will be on. There'll be the same old sermons and the same old appeals and the same old vague promises, only a new slogan or two, then millions of weeping women and fatherless children. "I believe," Craig began, then paused. "I believe," he began again. "I believe," he seemed to have lost his power to speak. At last he broke out, angrily, "I believe the women who are mothers. I believe they will remember. They will make it impossible." As he spoke, he had an image of Millie Dyer sitting in her little cottage, the tears in her eyes, her voice broken, her face tense with rage. Amir got up from where he had been sitting. "Let us go out. I must get out under the stars. The women will be glad to be left alone for a little while. We can talk better by ourselves." A moment later they were on the street, where Craig's car was standing at the curb before the apartment house. They seated themselves, and Craig prepared to start the engine. Suddenly, from across the street came the sound of a voice singing. Craig leaned from the side of the car and listened. A song had just ended, and a burst of applause followed. "Wait a minute," Craig said. "Let's listen." A moment later, the notes of a piano came to them from a window in the apartment house that stood on the opposite side of the street. Then the voice came again. "Dear one, the world is waiting for the sunrise. Every rose is heavy with dew." Craig did not wait for the song to end. He stepped down from his car and started across the street. "Wait for me," he said as he hurried away. A few moments later, he knocked at the door of Charnley's apartment. There was a sudden hush within, and then Charnley opened the door. As he did so, Craig put his foot against it and held it. "Will you tell Marion that I have called for her?" he said in a voice that was totally void of expression. "Sure, old man," Charnley replied. As he turned away to get Marion, Craig glanced into the apartment. Half a dozen men and women were lounging about in various stages of intoxication. In a few moments, Marion presented herself alone at the doorway, dressed and ready to leave. "Good night, all," she cried as she passed into the hall. Craig followed her till they reached the main entrance. Then he laid a hand on her shoulder. "Wait a minute," he said. He looked at her coldly, silently. "Marion," he said, "you have never lied to me. Did you lie to me tonight when you told me you were going out to a meeting of the executive?" Her face was pale as she heard his question. "I am not going to answer to you for every move I make," she evaded. He dropped his hand. "Very well," he said. "You have answered my question." When they reached the car, Amir offered to get out, but Craig urged him to stay. They drove off, no word coming from either Marion or Craig as the car sped down one street after another, across the bridge where Craig had first met Amir in the fog, and finally came to the street on which stood Gilbert Nason's home. "You will take me to Mother's, please," Marion said. "As you wish," Craig replied, and sent the car around the corner. Stay with me, Craig pleaded as he returned to the car from escorting Marion to Nason's door. Then, for more than an hour, they drove along a road that followed the river westward from the city, drove till they found a bridge that brought them to the north side of the river, and a long stretch of pavement that brought them back into the city again. It was long after midnight when they arrived at the corner of Main Street and Portage Avenue. Since they had left Marion, Craig had not spoken a word. Amir had talked a little, quietly, at long intervals, talked about the beauty of the night with the starlight touching the autumn leaves with a ghostly silver glow. Amir knew what was in his friend's mind and what was heavy on his heart. He had talked it all over with Jeanette many times. They had wondered just what would happen when Craig discovered the truth. They had promised each other to stand by him. Now that the moment had come, Amir found it impossible to do anything. And so he talked of the night and the stars and the eerie light on the leaves. As he put his car around the corner and started southward along the street in the general direction of home, a woman with a drunken companion reeled across the street in front of the car. Automatically, with an instinct born of long experience, he brought the car to a stand within a few inches of the woman. In the glare of the headlights, she turned to look at him, her leering face twisted into a silly grin. It was the face of Millie Dyer. Amir heard a groan from the man beside him, a deep groan of pain, such as he had heard in the battlefield when a man had been hit by a bullet. He waited till the man and woman moved out of the way. Then he put his hand on Craig's arm. "Let me take the wheel," he said quietly. Without protest, Craig sat gazing before him while Amir got down and came round to the other side of the car. Then he moved into Amir's place, while the latter climbed into the seat and started the car. No word passed between them until they reached the street in front of Craig's house. "I'll go in and stay with you tonight," Amir said quietly. "We can telephone the girls." He helped Craig out of the car and put a hand on his arm as they started up the walk to the house. But Craig shook the hand from his arm with a gesture of impatience and walked erect like a soldier on duty along the narrow pathway to the small porch that framed the doorway. He drew his latchkey from his pocket and, opening the door, stepped into the house. It was Amir who turned on the lights and telephoned to Jeanette in a voice that was almost inaudible. Then he went to the library, where he found Craig slumped in a chair before his desk. He put his hand on Craig's shoulder and was about to suggest that they go to bed. But Craig shook his shoulder impatiently, again without saying a word. Amir drew back quietly and found a deep chair where he could sit and watch his friend in the dim light of the room. After a long time, he saw him lift a pencil and lean forward as if to write on a piece of paper that lay under his hand. For fully half an hour, the pencil moved jerkily, and yet with a regularity that was not writing. Then the pencil was laid aside, and Amir got quietly to his feet and glanced over his friend's shoulder. On the sheet of white paper were a number of small triangles, and in the center, a large triangle, the lines of which had been traced over and over till they were little more than a blur. He moved back noiselessly to his chair and sat down, and so the two friends sat till it was morning. End of Part 3, Chapter 3.
Part 3, Chapter 4 of The Magpie by Douglas Durkin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Atul Sharma, Winnipeg, Canada. Part 3, Chapter 4. When Craig entered his office the next morning, he was like a man in a strange dream. Some seventh sense told him that he was in his place, and that some 15 minutes were yet to spare before he must enter the trading room. He gathered his slips of paper together, thrust a half-dozen trading cards into his pocket, and went into the corridors to make his early morning rounds of the firms for whom he had been doing business. The first man he met was Sharples, who hailed him from one end of the corridor as he stepped from his office.
"Fordyce is on the warpath this morning," he told Craig quietly. "I wouldn't be surprised to see his gang make a raid right now. We've got to stand up and take it if we're going to get out on the right side. Have you seen Charnley yet?"
"No."
"He'll be in for the opening,"
Sharples muttered to himself as he walked off. A few minutes later, Craig stood at the entrance to the boardroom and looked in at the gathering traders with a feeling as if he had come to a place he had never seen before. It was rather the feeling he had on the morning after his return from France, when he looked through the same doorway for the first time in 4 years. And as he watched his old associates hurrying past him, and heard the voices of the messenger boys as they ran to and fro, calling the names of the men they sought in the crowd, there came over him a vague feeling that he was looking on the scene for the last time. He turned at the sound of a voice at his shoulder. It was Cade, Charnley's partner. "Say, Magpie, are you carrying any barley for Claude Charnley?" Cade asked him. The instinct of the trader served Craig when he replied, "Ask Charnley." Cade turned on his heel and strode through the doorway and across the trading floor to the further side of the pit. A moment later, Craig entered the room and took his position at the upper edge of the pit to await the sound of the gong. Sharples' prediction concerning the Fordyce group showed signs of being fulfilled, the moment the gong struck the signal for the opening. From every side, the shorts crowded into the center of the pit, howling their offerings at an eighth, a quarter, 3/8 of a cent below the closing price of the previous day, which had been $1.62 1/4. Within a couple of minutes, the first trade was made at $1.61 7/8. Immediately, more barley was offered at another eighth of a cent lower. The bears were fighting hard to control the market from the opening. From his place at the upper edge of the pit, Craig watched carefully the men who were doing the trading. For some time he had been at pains to learn just who were in Fordyce's following. He knew them pretty well. He could see that none of the barley that had been thrown on the market at the opening had as yet been taken up by Cartwright or any of his men. Fordyce was offering barley through one broker and picking it up again through another in an attempt to depress the market. "Pounder! Pounder!" Cartwright yelled above the voices in the pit. For fully 20 minutes, Fordyce and his followers pursued the tactics with which they had begun when the market opened. At the end of that time, probably not 1,000 bushels of barley had actually changed hands, although a score or more trades had been recorded at prices ranging downward to within an eighth of a cent of $1.60. At that price, Cartwright swept down and bought 5,000 from a broker who he was convinced had been working for Fordyce. Immediately, he bid an eighth of a cent more and got another 5,000. He raised the price another eighth of a cent and called for more barley. This time there was no response. Not another trade was made until the price had reached $1.61, where it remained for an hour, at the end of which the activity had died away and comparative quiet prevailed. Fordyce and his men had been repulsed. Half an hour later, however, Craig sensed a new feeling in the air. 3 or 4 times during the past few minutes he had been asked concerning Charnley's whereabouts. Sharples came finally and led him quietly to one side, where they stood looking from a window with an air of idle curiosity at the smoke from a faraway locomotive rising against the clear sky of the morning.
"Listen, Magpie,"
Sharples said in a hoarse whisper, after he had talked for a few moments about the smoke.
"Something's gone wrong. Where's Charnley?"
"I haven't seen him," Craig replied.
"I got a story just now, never mind where, to the effect that he's through."
Craig stared at him. "Through?"
"He's quit. He's been carrying this stuff through 6 others, fellows we haven't known anything about. He may be long 3 or 4 million. If he's got cold feet, by God, we're in for it. What's that?"
As he spoke, the clamor in the pit rose suddenly to a deafening roar. "Come on, Magpie, get under it and hold her." Men were hurrying across the floor from every direction. One after another, 3 young brokers rushed up to Craig as he approached the pit and asked the same question that Sharples had asked. "Where's Charnley? Where's Charnley?" But Craig was the Magpie once more. To all, he turned an inscrutable face and growled in an undertone that conveyed no meaning to the men who had sought him out, to give them the information they desired. In his place once more at the top of the pit, Craig fought the bitterest fight of his life. Could it be true that Charnley had lost his nerve under the load he had been carrying, and had decided to throw the burden on the men who had trusted him to make good his losses in the event of a reverse? The rumors that had gone the rounds were very evidently taken as true by the men on the floor. At his elbow, 2 traders spoke, their voices reaching Craig above the roar of the pit. "Long 3 million, getting out of the country. Report from Cade." 3 million bushels. Craig made a quick reckoning of the total amount of barley he carried for Charnley. A little less than 500,000 bushels. He glanced at the price recorded on the last trade. It had dropped to $1.60. Already, Charnley's loss on what Craig held in his name was 1.5 cents a bushel, about $7,000. Craig had already given his check for $7,500 to cover losses on margins a couple of weeks before. A total loss to date of nearly $15,000 if Charnley failed to make good the losses he had sustained. And for every additional cent the market dropped, another $5,000 must be paid to the clearinghouse. The clamor in the pit had become deafening. One after another, the men who had been buying for Charnley threw their holdings into the market, preferring to take their present losses rather than risk complete bankruptcy by holding on in the hope of a recovery. On the opposite side of the pit from Craig, Cartwright stood, his hands in his pocket, a grin of defiance on his face. He looked across at Craig now and then, and smiled grimly as the price continued to drop, 1/8 at a time, until it had finally reached $1.59. When the next trade was made at a loss of another 1/8 cent, Sharples stepped up beside Craig and caught his arm.
"God, Magpie, if this thing goes on for another half hour, I'm broke. I'll not be able to put up the margins at the close. 2 more cents and I'm done. That'll make the 4th time in my life that I've gone through the bottom. Clean to hell."
Craig seized Sharples and swung him about till the 2 men faced each other. "You're not going yellow, are you?" he shouted above the din. "There are only 3 of us left. You and I and Cartwright. The rest have cold feet." As he spoke, Cartwright came into the market once more and bought 3 lots, one after another in quick succession, in an attempt to change the sentiment a little. But his efforts were of little avail. Fordyce and his men were pounding the market with all their power. Fordyce would buy 5,000 bushels and offer it immediately at 1/8 cent lower. He would buy 10,000 and sell it again at 0.5 cents a bushel less than he paid for it. And through it all, Craig stood as he had stood in the old days when they had first called him the Magpie, immovable, silent, his face grave and determined as he watched the churning mass about him like a hungry pack, howling for the blood of their victim. When the price finally touched $1.59, Craig heard a new voice above the clamor. It was Sharples. He had said a loss of 2 cents would make him bankrupt. 1 cent had melted away. He had only another cent to work on. Only good luck would make it possible for him to get rid of his load before the market broke below $1.57. Only 2 men were left to wage the fight against the Fordyce gang, Cartwright and the Magpie, and these two eyed each other across the scrambling traders, as 2 men might regard each other across a placid pool of water lying under the sun. When the price touched $1.57, Sharples withdrew and left the floor. He had sold out his holdings and had gone back to his office a penniless man. Just about all one man could expect of another, Craig thought to himself as he saw Sharples disappear into the corridor. He glanced at the clock. Only 10 minutes were left before the gong should sound again for the close. 5 minutes later, with the price at 57, Cartwright came into the market once more and bought everything that was offered him, in a last determined effort to turn back the enemy. Fordyce's men fell upon him in a mass. The din rose to a deafening climax. Collars and ties were torn away by clutching fingers. Men hurled themselves bodily into the thick of the conflict, as if their lives depended upon the fortunes of the next few minutes. And then, clear across the tumult of cries, came the note of the gong. The market was closed. The cries died down quickly. The men left the pit and scattered to all parts of the floor. The hum of voices was broken only by the sharp staccato of the telegraph keys. The crowd thinned until there were only a few stragglers left in the room. The recorders climbed down from their places and went off in 2s and 3s to where their coats and hats hung in the lobby. The doorkeeper spoke sharply to a half-dozen lingerers and was chaffed for his officiousness. The janitors appeared with their brooms and brushes to mop up the fragments of paper that littered the floor. The doors were closed, and only the faint echoes from the corridors floated back as a reminder of the struggle that was past. As Craig left the building, Cartwright came up behind him and touched his shoulder. "Magpie, by God, we could lick that whole gang ourselves if we had it to do. Did you go far behind?" "Not far, but enough to do." "Where in hell is Charnley? What happened to him?" Craig shook his head. A fear had gripped his heart that made him afraid to speak of Charnley. Before leaving his office, he had telephoned home. When he had received no reply, he had called Mrs. Nason, only to learn that Marion had gone out about noon and would not be back till 5 o'clock. Then he had called Charnley's apartment without getting any response. Of course, a man must not knuckle under to fear, especially when there was only a suspicion. Besides, he had to give his mind to other things for the present. He had figured his losses following the close of the market. He had been forced to write a check for $18,900, and his total credit in the bank was less than $15,000. That afternoon was to remain forever a blank in the mind of Craig Forrester. He had first gone home and searched through each room in turn for some trace of Marion. From there he had gone to the Nason home and walked about the house without speaking to Mrs. Nason, who followed him from place to place, asking him questions he did not hear. He had gone to Charnley's apartment, only to find the door locked, and had waited for an interminable time, knocking and listening, waiting and knocking and listening again, only to turn away at last like one lost. He had gone to Jeanette's place, knocked, waited, and listened. There was no response. Had the world then grown suddenly cold? Was there no friend anywhere whose voice he might listen to for just a moment, while he felt his way back again out of the darkness that was closing in about him? Then he remembered that Amir had gone with him to the office and had left him to attend a meeting of the strikers in the north end of the city. He had driven to the Board of Trade building where Martha had held her exhibit. How long ago it seemed. There he had found both Martha and Jeanette busy packing the exhibit to send it back to the Lane farm. He had watched them in silence for a long time. Then they had heard him mutter something about having to find Charnley, a loss in the market. Had Marion come back? And after he had gone, they realized that he had acted strangely. From there he had driven over the city, up one street, down another, looking into the faces of everyone he met, seeking. When it was dusk, he had come back home and put his car in the garage at the back of the house. For a long time then, he had wandered about the garage, tinkering at this and that, lifting something only to put it down again, wiping the dust from his car, going to the house for something only to forget what he wanted when he got there, returning to the garage and tinkering again. Finally, he had stood for a long time, looking into the odds and ends box,
vaguely wondering if what he sought might not be there. Then he realized that it was something else he sought, not in the odds and ends box, but in the streets. He left the garage and walked out into the street, found his way across the bridge in the deepening darkness, saw that there was a heavy fog settling on the river, but passed on without pausing to seek out the beauty he had once seen there. And presently, when it had grown quite dark, he came again to the house where Charnley lived. When he knocked on the door, little hollow echoes awoke at the end of the corridors. Presently, a step sounded lightly from within. The doorknob turned softly. The door opened uncertainly. Marian's face appeared before him for a second, then vanished suddenly as the door was closed abruptly. A madness seized him. Stepping back a little, he hurled the whole weight of his body against the door. There was a crash of splintering wood and a startled cry from within. He stepped back once more to break the barrier that still obstructed his path, but as he prepared to spring, Marian's face appeared once more, and he stepped through the open doorway. Closing the door behind him, he followed her into a large room where only the night before there had been merrymaking among Charnley's friends. Marian sank into a chair and buried her face in her hands. He looked at her unsteadily a moment, then took a step towards her. "I want you to come home," he said. But she did not reply. He heard her sobbing softly and started forward to console her. Halfway he paused. No, not that," she said. "It always hurts me, that. I want him, Claude." She continued to sob. "Where is he?" he asked. His voice was as gentle now as if he were speaking to a child. When she did not answer, he went to a chair on the opposite side of the room from her and sat down. With his hands resting on the arms of the chair, he looked at her for a moment, then at the rich furnishings of the apartment, its curtains of fine velour, its polished table with a small rack of books in the center of it, its deeply upholstered couch, its tall lamp with shade of figured silk, its mirror and its pictures that adorned the walls, its piano with the white keys shining in the soft light. Well, he had found her. He could rest a little before they went back home. Back home. Were they going back home again? The sharp click of a key in a lock caused him to turn his eyes toward the door that led into the hall. A door was opening somewhere and was closing again. There was the sound of a footfall and then a voice. "Marian!" The voice had spoken very low, but it was the voice of Claude Charnley. A sob broke from Marian, and Charnley stepped quickly into the room. From where he sat, Craig eyed him for some moments in silence. Then he got slowly to his feet, as if rising cost him a great effort. As he did so, Charnley came slowly across the floor and stood between him and Marian. No word was spoken until Craig presently drew a deep breath and passed a hand over his eyes as if to clear his vision. "They told me you were gone," he said. "We held them, the Fordyce crew. Cartwright and I held them." He laughed, a strained laugh, the laugh of a man whose senses have left him. "We can do it tomorrow, Charnley. With your help, your money, your 100,000. That was lucky, eh?" Charnley spoke for the first time. "I can't help you, old man. I didn't tell you, but I lost every cent in a flax deal a month ago. I can't help you with $1. The man to whom he spoke looked dazed for a moment, then smiled. Then he began rocking slowly back and forth and rubbing the palms of his hands on his thighs. The muscles about his mouth grew tense. He sniffed a little, put his head on one side and smiled again. "Of course. Lost. Of course." His smile grew to a laugh as he stepped toward Charnley and lifted his hands slowly. "Of course. Lost. I don't care. Not now. Now that I've found her. Money, huh? Well, come on home." Charnley looked at him in terror. "God, he's mad," he whispered hoarsely. As he spoke, Marian sprang up from where she had been sitting and with a cry seized Charnley's arm. "Don't be afraid, Marian," said a voice that should have been Craig's, a voice so strange that she could never have recognized it. "I won't let him hurt you. I'll get him." The words had no sooner left his lips than he sprang at Charnley and caught his two shoulders in his powerful hands. He lurched backward suddenly and turned.
Charnley's feet left the floor, and he shot bodily through the air and crashed to the floor at the further end of the room. He gathered himself together and, springing to his feet, made a rush for the door, but Craig was upon him again. Seizing him about the waist, he lifted him clear of the floor and threw him back into the room, where he fell scrambling at the feet of Marion. In a moment, he was on his feet again, and with Marion behind him, was setting himself for a third assault, but none came. Near the door, Craig stood breathing heavily from his exertions. His face had lost its tense expression. For the moment he looked as he had always looked, the glance from his clear eyes piercingly cold, his eyelids slightly closed, his head thrust forward. I know, he said. Both liars. And I ought to kill you here. Now, with my 2 hands, I ought to break you like this. As he spoke, he picked a vase from a stand beside him and crushed it between his hands. Like this. He lifted the table that held the books and reduced it to splinters on the floor at his feet. He tore bric-a-brac from its place against the wall and crumpled it in his fingers. He tore the curtains from the arch that led into the hall and ripped them to ribbons. He seized the tall lamp that stood beside the piano, snapped the slender pedestal over his knee, and sent the pieces crashing into the mirror against the wall. Suddenly, there was a thumping at the door, and he turned toward it, a look of expectancy in his face. "Amir," he said. "Amir." He strode to the door and flung it open. "Amir." But it was not Amir. The superintendent of the block had come to learn the cause of the disturbance. He brushed the man aside and stepped into the hall. "Amir! Amir, where are you? Amir! Amir!" Presently he reached the street. Hatless, he hurried off through the darkness. "Amir! Amir!" Something led him northward along the main street of the city. It was there he had hoped to find Amir earlier in the day. As he approached Market Square, the street was full of men and women who were hurrying in the same direction with him. No one seemed to pay any attention to the man who was running bareheaded along the street, crying unintelligible things as he picked his way in and out among the crowd. From somewhere ahead came the cries and clamor of a mob. Directly in front of the city hall, he came into the center of a convulsed mob that filled the street from side to side. He paused a moment and looked around at the faces made red by the glow of burning torches. "Amir!" No response reached his ears, but above the heads of those nearest him, he saw something that arrested his attention. Somewhere in there he had caught sight of a face that was familiar. He had seen it a moment, and then it was gone. He pushed his way through the crowd, his eyes fixed on the spot where he had last seen the face. Something was happening there. Someone he knew was in trouble. He did not see the blows that were being struck on either side of him. He did not hear the cries and curses that filled the air. He was searching. There it was again. It was the pale, thin face of the boy he had known as Ivan. Even as he looked, the face disappeared once more. Ivan had been struck down. Someone in that mob saw Craig leap forward into the thick of the struggling mass. "God, there goes the Magpie! Look!" The man who spoke saw Craig fight his way to the center, where lay the helpless body of the boy who had been struck down. Saw him strike left and right at anyone who blocked his way, then saw him set upon by a half-dozen at once. He threw them off him and cleared a space before him, only to be set upon from another quarter by a half-dozen more. In the torchlight, a heavy club rose suddenly behind him and fell. "He's down! The Magpie's down!" The man who spoke was Croker. "Good God, he's up again!" And it was true. Lifting himself from the pavement, he stood above the body of the boy and fought with all the fury of a madman to turn back the unreasoning ones who crowded in to attack him. For a full minute he fought. Then it was as if a great flame of fire had leaped suddenly in his brain, and after that, a great darkness. End of Part 3, Chapter 4. Part 3, Chapter 5 of The Magpie by Douglas Durkin. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Atul Sharma, Winnipeg, Canada. Part 3, Chapter 5. Craig's first impression was of a world all white and strangely still, and then of white objects moving noiselessly about and casting no shadows. Soon, voices spoke. They seemed to be speaking to him from a great distance. Then he was aware of something touching his hand, ever so softly, and again a voice that spoke very close to him now. "Craigie!" He turned his head, slowly, painfully, then closed his eyes as the whole world about him began to turn dizzily, round and round. Presently he opened his eyes again. He could see clearly now, for a moment. He was lying on a white bed, in a white room. Someone was sitting beside him, looking down at him, touching his hand with her fingers. "Marty?" His voice was little more than a whisper, and strangely unlike his own. "Craigie, don't move. Don't talk." Then, after a little while, he seemed to fall asleep again. When he awoke, he was alone. A form clad all in white came to him and spoke very softly, then moved away. In a moment, Martha Lane stepped noiselessly to the side of the bed and lifted his hand. "Are you feeling better, Craigie?" she asked. "Lots," he replied. "I'm all right." After a moment, he tried once more to speak. "But where is... Martha leaned over him. "Don't talk, Craigie. Not yet awhile." He began to realize that something terrible must have happened to him. The thought turned him sick. He closed his eyes again as if he would shut out the sight of something he did not wish to see. And after a moment, he fell asleep once more. There followed days, then days during which he slept long hours away and awoke to find Martha coming towards him, and presently to feel her fingers caress his brow and touch his hand. And always he knew he must not talk, must not ask questions. Especially, it seemed, he must not ask about Marion. Then one day came Jeanette, and with her Amir, to stay for only a few minutes without much talking, and then to go away again, just when he wanted to ask Amir some questions. The manner of their going made him wonder too. Jeanette had kissed him with tears in her eyes, and Amir had stood for a long time, holding his hand and pressing his fingers softly, the tears streaming from his great dark eyes. They thought he had not seen that, but he had, and he remembered. Days after, he asked Martha why they didn't come, but she patted his hand gently and told him they would be back soon. Something told him they would not come again. As the days passed and he grew stronger, he became more and more silent. Then one day, he was told he might sit up in bed with the pillows behind him for support. He smiled to himself at the efforts Martha and the nurse put forth to lift his shoulders, so that they could get the pillows into position. He thought it funny that his arms were so nearly useless to help them. But when he lay back against the pillows and looked at Martha standing beside him, he made up his mind to talk. "Sit down, Marty," he said. "I want to talk to you." She sat down close to the bedside. "You have not told me anything," he said. "Lately I haven't asked, because I know. I don't know yet just what happened. If it's bad for me to know it, I can wait. But I remember something. I remember seeing her, and him that was with her, and I remember breaking something in my hands. I didn't harm them, did I? No, Craigie. I'm glad. I remember something, a strange feeling about my temples, a feeling as if somewhere inside a rubber band had been stretched till it wouldn't go back again. And I remember a crowd somewhere. And what happened after that?" "You were hurt," Martha told him, "and they brought you here." "Then you came, and you've been with me ever since?" For a while he was silent. "Don't sit up too long," she cautioned him. "If you feel tired, you must let me know." "Tired?" he smiled. "I'm as fit as a fiddle. Marty, you and I made a mistake when we..." Though her heart was hungry for what he wanted to say, she got up quickly and leaned over him. "Craig, dear, you mustn't talk any more. Let me take the pillows away." He drew a deep sigh and let her have her way. Then he lay down on the bed and put his head on the cool pillow. After all, it was very comfortable there, and he was tired, and yet
A great hunger had entered his heart. Days later, when he was permitted to leave his bed and sit in a chair by the window, he had a visit from Croker. Martha left them alone in the room and closed the door behind her as she went out. They had cigarettes and a cup of hot tea, while Croker chattered freely about all manner of things that had occurred since Craig had left the world. The strike had been settled at last, as Amir had predicted it would be settled, with a victory for Blunt. Tuttle still swayed the minds of his people and moved them with his fiery eloquence, but already his position was becoming a little uncertain. It seemed a new voice, as eloquent as his own, had made itself heard as a result of the failure of the strike, a failure for which many were disposed to hold Tuttle responsible. In the meantime, Blunt was more secure than ever. Nason's men had returned to their work, and Nason himself had hired an efficiency expert to reorganize his plant. In Europe, the time-honored game of secret diplomacy was fast becoming the favorite sport of the governments. Although Craig had been confined to his bed for less than 3 weeks, Croker told him the news as he might have told it to a man who had just returned from a year's sojourn in the northern wilds. After a long silence, Craig spoke up at last. "Of course, Croker," he said, "you haven't come in to tell me all this, though it's interesting, and I'm glad to hear you talk again. But they let you in because they knew you had the nerve to tell me what none of the others would mention. Well, tell me. Out with it." Croker lighted himself another cigarette. "You're a good guesser, Magpie," he said. "I guess I needn't tell you about what happened on the market the next day. You got that pretty well figured out here by yourself." "I've got that figured out, just as you say. They'd have to sell me out. There wouldn't be a thing left. But that's what a man may look for any time in life, and it really doesn't matter, a lot. But there'll be time to think of that later." He waited for Croker to go on. "Well, since you must know, they have gone." "Gone?" Craig repeated. "I feared as much. I believe I expected it. Only I didn't let myself admit it. To tell you the truth, Croker, well, let's say no more about it just now. It's ugly." "I have managed to keep it pretty well out of the papers," Croker remarked. "Of course, a thing like that can't be kept." I know, Craig interrupted him. "That was good of you. And Amir, something has happened there, I know. I knew it when he came to see me the last time." "Yes, Blunt won out in handy style all round. Poor old Amir was arrested on a charge of having treasonable literature in his possession. He was given a quick trial by the authorities and was made an example of to the community. He's now on his way back to England, deported." Craig was silent for a long time after Croker had ceased speaking. Finally he looked up. "And Jeanette, of course?" "Oh, she went with him. At least she followed on the next boat. He told me she had consented to marry him as soon as they arrived on the other side, and he was as pleased about it as a boy." "And so the world goes on," Craig said slowly. "And so the merry goes round," Croker added with a smile. When the month of October was drawing to a close in a glorious Indian summer, Craig stepped aboard a streetcar in the late afternoon. For several days he had been going about the city in the pursuit of the ugly business he had still to do. There were lawyers and documents and sworn statements and a host of other things that could not be avoided. He had come out of it all with only a few dollars in his pocket and without a foot of real estate in the city. His house was gone and his car, and he had surrendered his seat on the exchange to help meet his obligations. But when he was through, penniless as he was, he owed no man $1. He was free. The car took him south from the city, to a point where he found another awaiting him, to carry him southward still through many miles of open country, with quaint little French-Canadian settlements on either hand. He ate his supper at a little French house where he was known, and paid them for a night's lodging. And while the night was but half gone, he stole out under the stars and took the road that led into the east. When he had walked a couple of hours or more, the grey promise of a new day began to lift before him. From the side of the road came the sound of a waking bird. Presently, the leaves that still clung to the branches of the trees began to take on color, yellow and brown and crimson. And in the sky before him, as he walked steadily on, the shafts of gold shot to the zenith,
flooding the earth with the faint glow of early dawn. Then, suddenly, the woods were awake with flocking birds that rose from the ground in clouds and settled among the branches of the trees. Finding a little slope all soft carpeted with brown leaves, he threw himself upon the ground to rest a while before he went on. And as he lay, with his body stretched at full length upon the earth, new strength seemed to come to him, the fresh new strength of the earth itself. And when the sun rose, he lifted himself from the ground and made his way still eastward, with the new day on his face and brow. Another hour brought him to a field he had known and had remembered often in his dreams. As he stood beside it and let his eyes cover its generous expanse, a team of dark horses entered the field at the further end, and stood while their driver hitched them to a plough. Presently there came a sound of the ploughman's voice, and the horses strained forward in their traces. He watched them come down the full length of the field, leaving behind them a fresh new furrow through the stubble. And when they were still some distance away, he clambered through the fence and waited till their heads were within reach of his hands. Farmer Lane stepped from behind the plough and looked at him. "Well, it's taken you a damn long time to get back where you belong," said Farmer Lane. Craig smiled. "I'm not there yet," he replied. "I want to get over on that place my dad left with you. If you think you're fit for it, after living like a tramp for the best part of your days." For answer, Craig took his position behind the plough and put the horses about. A moment later, he had them headed toward the other end of the field, leaving behind them a furrow as true and straight as its mate. "Well," Farmer Lane remarked, "you've not lost the knack. Maybe you'll do. You'd better go in and get some breakfast." A short walk brought him to the gate at the end of the little path leading to an open doorway, in which stood Martha Lane with the sun in her hair. "I have come back," he said as he came before her and gave her his hands. And together they went into the house and closed the door behind them. The end. End of Part 3, Chapter 5. End of Part 3. End of The Magpie by Douglas Durkin.